The anonymous child, a mystery spanning generations. The discovery, the musty smell of old paper, and forgotten memories filled Dr. Sarah Chen's nostrils as she carefully sorted through the estate donation that had arrived at the historical archives of New England. That morning, as their head archivist, she had seen countless photographs, documents and artifacts pass through these doors, but something about this particular collection made her pause. The donation had come from the estate of Margaret Whitmore, a reclusive elderly woman who had passed away the previous month with no immediate family. Her lawyer had contacted the archives, explaining that Miss Whitmore had specifically requested that her personal collection be donated to preserve local history. What struck Sarah immediately was the meticulous organization of the materials. Everything was carefully labeled, dated, and preserved in acid-free containers. It was while examining a leather-bound album marked Family Photographs, Descendants 20, the photograph, measuring approximately 4x6 inches, was mounted on thick cardstock, with the date en Atlantis 37 written in faded blue ink beneath it. The image quality was remarkably clear for its age, suggesting it had been taken by someone with considerable skill and proper equipment. The photograph depicted a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing in what appeared to be a formal garden. The child's gender was ambiguous. They wore a simple white cotton dress that could have been appropriate for either a boy or girl of that era, and their hair was cut in a short, practical style common among children of. What made the photograph truly striking, however, were the child's eyes. They held an intensity that seemed almost supernatural, as if the child possessed knowledge far beyond their years. The background of the photograph provided several intriguing clues. Behind the child stood an ornate iron gate with distinctive scroll work, and beyond that, a large Victorian mansion was partially visible. The architecture suggested wealth and prominence, with elaborate bay windows and decorative trim work characteristic of late 19th century. To the left of the frame, a portion of what appeared to be a memorial statue could be seen, though only the base and part of a draped figure were visible. What troubled Sarah most was not what the photograph showed, but what it didn't show. There was no identification on the back, no family name written in the margins, and no other photographs in the collection that featured this particular child. It was as if this single image had been deliberately isolated from any context that might reveal the child's identity. Sarah had been working in historical preservation for over 15 years, and she had developed an instinct for recognizing significant discoveries. This photograph felt important in a way she couldn't quite articulate. The composition was too deliberate, the preservation too careful, and the child's expression too haunting for this to be merely a forgotten family snapshot. She carefully removed the photograph from its mounting and examined it under a magnifying glass. The paper stock was of high quality, consistent with professional photography of the era. More importantly, she noticed something that made her heart race. In the lower right corner, barely visible unless one knew where to look, was a small embossed mark. It appeared to be a photographer's stamp, though the text was too faded to read clearly. Sarah spent the remainder of that day cataloging the rest of Mrs. Whitmore's donation, but her mind kept returning to the mysterious child. The other photographs in the collection were typical of the era: family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and formal portraits. There were images of Mrs. Whitmore as a young woman, her parents, and various relatives spanning several decades. Yet nowhere else in the entire collection did the anonymous child appear. That evening, Sarah took the unusual step of bringing the photograph home with her. She knew it violated protocol, but something about the image compelled her to study it more closely. Under the bright lights of her home office, she was able to make out additional details that had escaped her notice earlier. The child's clothing, while simple, appeared to be of good quality. The white dress was well tailored and showed no signs of wear or mending. The child's shoes were leather and appeared to be expensive. These details suggested that the child came from a family of some means. which made their absence from the rest of the photographic record even more puzzling. Using a high-powered magnifying glass, Sarah was finally able to decipher part of the photographer's mark. She could make out what appeared to be audio, and below that, this suggested the photograph had been taken by a professional studio in Boston, which was consistent with the apparent wealth of the subject's family. As Sarah continued her examination, she noticed something else that sent a chill down her spine. In the shadows behind the iron gate, barely visible in the background, was what appeared to be another figure. It was so faint that it could have been a trick of light and shadow, but the more she stared at it, the more convinced she became that someone else had been present when the photograph was taken. The discovery of this hidden figure transformed what had been mere curiosity into something approaching obsession. Sarah realized that this photograph might be more than just a family portrait. It could be evidence of something significant, perhaps even tragic. The child's haunting expression, the careful preservation of the image, and now the mysterious background figure, all suggested a story that demanded to be uncovered. That night, Sarah lay awake, thinking about the anonymous child. Who were they? What had happened to them? And why had this single photograph been preserved so carefully while all other traces of the child seemed to have vanished? She had no way of knowing that her discovery would lead her down a path that would challenge everything she thought she knew about historical research, family secrets, and the power of a single image to connect the past with the present. Sarah arrived at the archives the next morning with renewed determination and a plan of action. Her first step was to research the photographer's studio marks she had partially deciphered. Using the archive's extensive collection of Boston business directories from the 1930s, she began searching for photography studios that might match the fragmentary text. After 2 hours of methodical searching, she found what she was looking for. Pemberton Studio had operated on Beacon Street in Boston from 1925 to 1925, specializing in formal portraits in society photography. The studio's advertisements in contemporary newspapers emphasized their discretion and their clientele among Boston's elite families. This information aligned perfectly with the quality of the photograph and the apparent wealth suggested by the child's clothing and the mansion in the background. Sarah's next step was to research the Pemberton Studio's records. A call to the Boston Public Library's Archives Department revealed that the studio's business records had been donated to their collection in 19. The librarian, a helpful woman named Janet Morrison, agreed to pull the relevant files for Sarah's examination. The drive to Boston took Sarah through the same neighborhoods where the photograph had likely been taken nearly 90 years earlier. As she navigated the historic streets of Beacon Hill and Back Bay, she found herself studying the architecture, looking for buildings that might match the mansion visible in the background of the mysterious photograph. At the Boston Public Library, Janet Morrison had prepared a comprehensive collection of materials related to Pemberton Studio. The records included appointment books, client lists, and even some original negatives that had been preserved as examples of the studio's work. Sarah felt a surge of excitement as she realized that if the child in the photograph had been a client of Pemberton Studio, there might be records that could reveal their identity. The appointment books for Harrison Pemberton had been meticulous in his record-keeping, noting not only the names of his clients, but often including brief descriptions of the sessions and the subjects photographed. Sarah began working through the entries for the spring and summer of 1937, when the lighting and foliage in the mysterious photograph suggested it had been taken. It was while examining the entries for June 1937 that Sarah found something that made her pulse quicken. On June 15th, there was an entry that read, "Private session, estate grounds, child portrait, special arrangements, payment in advance." Unlike the other entries, this one included no client name, only the cryptic notation, "Ref MBW Confidential." The initials MWB immediately caught Sarah's attention. Could they refer to Margaret Whitmore, the woman whose estate had donated the photograph collection? If so, it would suggest that Miss Whitmore had not only known the identity of the anonymous child, but had been directly involved in commissioning the photograph. Sarah spent the rest of the day examining the other Pemberton studio records, looking for any additional references to embadobio or confidential sessions. She found two more entries that appeared to be related. One from July 1937 for document photography, estate materials, and another from August 1937 for archive consultation, historical preservation. These entries painted a picture of someone who was not only commissioning photography, but was also concerned with preserving and documenting materials for historical purposes. The pattern suggested that Margaret Whitmore, even as a young woman, had been thinking about how to preserve important information for future generations. As the library prepared to close, Janet Morrison approached Sarah with an additional piece of information. "He remembered something after we spoke this morning," she said. "We have a small collection of Harrison Pemberton's personal papers that were donated separately from the business records. They include some correspondence and personal notes. You might find something relevant." The personal papers were stored in a different section of the archives, and Janet agreed to have them pulled for Sarah's examination the following day. As Sarah drove back to her hotel that evening, she felt that she was finally making progress in unraveling the mystery of the anonymous child. That night, Sarah used her laptop to research Margaret Whitmore's family history. Online genealogy databases revealed that Margaret had been born in. She had been the daughter of Charles and Eleanor Whitmore, prominent members of Boston society who had owned significant real estate holdings throughout New England. The Whitmore family history was well documented in local newspapers and society pages. Charles Whitmore had been a successful businessman who had made his fortune in textile manufacturing. The family had owned several properties, including a large estate in the affluent suburb of Brookline. Newspaper accounts from the 1920s frequently mentioned the Whitmores' charitable activities and their involvement in various cultural organizations. What struck Sarah as so significant was that the newspaper coverage of the Whitmore family from 1927 showed a marked change in tone. Earlier articles had focused on their social activities and business successes, but beginning in the summer of 1998, the coverage became more subdued and formal. There were fewer mentions of social gatherings and more focus on charitable donations and community service. Sarah also discovered that Margaret Whitmore had never married and had no children of her own. She had lived a relatively private life, managing the family's remaining properties and continuing their charitable work until her death the previous month. This information raised new questions about the anonymous child in the photograph. If Margaret had commissioned the portrait and preserved it so carefully, what was her relationship to the child? As Sarah prepared for bed, she realized that her research was revealing a complex web of connections between the photograph, the Pemberton studio, and the Whitmore family. The anonymous child was no longer just a mysterious figure in an old photograph. They were becoming the center of a story that involved some of Boston's most prominent families and spanned nearly a century. The next morning would bring new discoveries that would deepen the mystery even further and set Sarah on a path that would ultimately lead her to living descendants of the anonymous child. People who had no idea that their family's history was about to be dramatically revealed through the power of a single, carefully preserved photograph. Sarah returned to the Boston Public Library early the next morning, eager to examine Harrison Pemberton's personal papers. Janet Morrison had prepared a small collection of boxes containing the photographer's correspondence, personal notes, and miscellaneous documents that had been deemed too personal for the main business archive. The first box contained routine correspondence, letters from suppliers, communications with other photographers, and personal notes about technique and equipment. It was in the second box that Sarah found what she was looking for. A manila folder marked Confidential Clients, Special Arrangements. Inside the folder were copies of letters and agreements related to photography sessions that required unusual discretion or special handling. The documents were arranged chronologically, and Sarah quickly located the materials related to the summer of 1937. The first document was a letter dated June 10. The letter was brief but revealing. "Dear Mr. Pemberton, I am writing to arrange for a very sensitive photography session that will require your utmost discretion. The subject is a child who has been placed in our care under circumstances that necessitate complete confidence. The session must be conducted at our estate grounds, and no records of the child's identity should be maintained in your standard files. I am prepared to compensate you generously for this special arrangement, and for your assurance that this matter will be handled with the privacy it requires. Please advise if you are willing to accept this commission under these terms. Respectfully, Margaret A. Whitmore. Sarah felt her heart racing as she read the letter. This was the first concrete evidence that Margaret Whitmore had indeed commissioned the mysterious photograph, and more importantly, it revealed that the child had been placed in their care under circumstances that necessitate complete confidentiality. The next document was Harrison Pemberton's reply dated June 10th. Dear Miss Whitmore, I am honored by your confidence in my discretion and professionalism. I have handled similar sensitive matters for other prominent families and understand the importance of maintaining absolute confidentiality. I am prepared to accept your commission under the terms you have outlined. I suggest we schedule a session for the afternoon of June 15th, weather permitting. I will bring portable equipment to your estate and will ensure that the session is conducted with the privacy you require. As requested, no standard client records will be maintained, and the only documentation will be the photographs themselves, which will be delivered directly to you. Respectfully yours, Harrison Pemberton. The correspondence continued with logistic details about the photography session, but it was the final letter in the sequence that provided the most shocking revelation. Dated August 3, Pemberton, I am writing to inform you of a tragic development that makes our previous correspondent even more sensitive than originally anticipated. The child who was the subject of our June photography session has passed away unexpectedly. The circumstances surrounding the child's death are being investigated by the authorities, and it is imperative that our session remains completely confidential. I am enclosing an additional payment for your continued discretion in this matter. Should anyone inquire about photography sessions conducted at our estate during the summer of 1936, the photographs you provided have become precious beyond measure, as they may be the only visual record of this child's brief time with us. I intend to preserve them carefully for reasons that I hope will become clear in the future. With sincere gratitude for your understanding, Margaret Whitmore. Sarah stared at the letter, her mind reeling from the implications. The anonymous child in the photograph had died shortly after the image was taken, and the circumstances had apparently warranted investigation by authorities. This transformed the mysterious photograph from a simple family portrait into something much more significant, possibly the last image ever taken of a child whose death had been suspicious enough to require official investigation. The revelation also explained why the photograph had been preserved so carefully and why it had been isolated from other family materials. Margaret Whitmore had recognized its historical importance and had taken steps to ensure its preservation, even while maintaining the secrecy that the circumstances had apparently required. Sarah continued examining the personal papers, hoping to find additional information about the case. In a folder marked Personal Notes, Yento Decente, she found Harrison Pemberton's own account of the photography session. Written in his careful handwriting, the note provided details that the formal correspondence had omitted. June 15, 1918, Estate Session for Ms. Whitmore. Unusual circumstances. Child appeared to be approximately 7-8 years old, well-dressed, but seemed withdrawn and fearful. No family members present during session except Miss Whitmore, who remained at a distance. Child spoke very little, seemed to understand English but may have been more comfortable with another language. Notices bruising on child's arms that appeared recent. Miss Whitmore explained Charles had been in an accident, but seemed evasive about details. Charles' eyes were remarkable, very expressive and seemed to hold great sadness. Session conducted in formal garden area of estate. Child was cooperative but appeared tired and unwell. Took several portraits, but Child seemed most comfortable when allowed to simply stand naturally rather than pose formally. Note: something about this situation troubles me. Child seems to be hiding or being hidden. Miss Whitmore's insistence on secrecy suggests circumstances beyond normal family privacy concerns. This personal account provided crucial new information about the anonymous child. The photographer's obsessions about the child's apparent fear, the bruising, and the suggestion that English might not have been their first language painted a picture of a child who might have been a refugee or victim of some kind of trauma. The reference to bruising in the child's fearful demeanor took on sinister implications when considered alongside the later news of the child's death and official investigation. Sarah began to wonder if she had stumbled upon evidence of a historical crime that had been covered up by one of Boston's most prominent families. As she continued reading through Pemberton's notes, Sarah found one final entry that would prove to be the key to unlocking the mystery. Dated September 3, followed Miss Whitmore's instructions and claimed no knowledge of any photography sessions at the estate. Detective seemed suspicious but had no evidence to contradict my statement. Left his card in case I remembered anything relevant to the investigation. Detective's name, Thomas Sullivan, Boston Police Department. Note: the photograph the detective showed me was definitely the child I photographed in June. The case appears to involve more than just an accidental death. I pray I have made the right decision in maintaining confidentiality. This final note confirmed Sarah's growing suspicion that the anonymous child's death had been the subject of a criminal investigation. More importantly, it provided her with a new lead, Detective Thomas Sullivan of the Boston Police Department. If police records from the investigation still existed, they might contain information that could finally reveal the child's identity and the true circumstances of their death. Sarah spent the remainder of the day copying the relevant documents and making detailed notes about her discoveries. As she prepared to leave the library, she realized that her research had taken a dramatic turn. What had begun as curiosity about an anonymous child in an old photograph had become an investigation into a possible historical crime and cover-up. The evidence suggested that Margaret Whitmore had been involved in hiding a child whose death had subsequently become the subject of a police investigation. The careful preservation of the photograph now seemed less like family sentiment and more like the actions of someone who knew that the image might someday be important evidence. As Sarah drove back to her hotel, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into a story that was much larger and more dangerous than she had initially realized. The anonymous child was no longer just a mystery to be solved. They were a victim whose story demanded to be told, regardless of the powerful families who had tried to keep it hidden. Sarah's next step required a different approach entirely. Accessing police records from 1937 would be challenging, particularly for a case that appeared to have been sensitive enough to warrant a cover-up. She decided to start with the Boston Police Department's Historical Records Division, hoping that the passage of nearly 90 years might have made the files accessible to researchers. The Boston Police Department's Records Division was housed in a modern building that contrasted sharply with the historic neighborhood Sarah had been exploring. Detective Lieutenant Maria Santos, who supervised the Historical Records Unit, greeted Sarah with professional courtesy but obvious skepticism about her request. Police records from 1937 involving the death of an unidentified child, Detective Santos repeated, reviewing Sarah's formal request. It's a very specific inquiry. May I ask what prompted this research? Sarah explained her discovery of the photograph and the subsequent correspondence she had found in the Pemberton studio archive. She was careful to present her research as academic inquiry rather than suggesting any impropriety by the police department or prominent families. Detective Santos listened carefully before responding. Records from that era are not typically available to the public, especially those involving ongoing investigations. However, if the case was officially closed and enough time has passed, we might be able to provide some basic information. The detective disappeared into the record storage area for nearly an hour. When she returned, she carried a thin manila folder that looked remarkably well preserved for its age. You're in luck, Detective Santos said. The case you're asking about was officially closed in October 1937, and the file has been cleared for historical research access. However, I should warn you that the case was never solved and some of the details are quite disturbing. The file was labeled Case 77247, Unidentified Child, Suspicious Death, Whitmore Estate. As Sarah opened it, she felt a mixture of excitement and dread about what she might discover. The first document was the initial police report, filed on August 8. The report was brief but chilling, responded to call from Whitmore Estate, 47 Elmelle Street, Brookline, regarding discovery of deceased child on property grounds. Child found by groundskeeper in wooded area approximately 200 yards from main house. Body appeared to have been concealed under brush and fallen leaves. Child estimated to be 7-8 years old. Gender uncertain due to decomposition. Clothing suggests middle-class background. No immediate identification found on body. Estate owner, Miss Margaret Whitmore, claims no knowledge of child's identity or how body came to be on property. Scene secure pending investigation. Coroner notified. Case assigned to Detective Thomas Sullivan for follow-up in investigation. The next document was Detective Sullivan's initial investigation report, which provided much more detail. Investigation into death of an unidentified child found at Whitmore Estate reveals several concerning factors. Preliminary examination by coroner suggests child had been deceased for approximately 6 weeks, placing time of death in late June or early July. Groundskeeper James Murphy claims to have noticed strange activities around the estate during summer months, but was instructed by Miss Whitmore not to discuss estate business with outsiders. Housekeeper Miss Catherine O'Brien appeared nervous and evasive when questioned about visitors to the estate. Miss Margaret Whitmore maintains that she has no knowledge of the child's identity. Claims estate is frequently visited by children from neighborhood who may have been playing on grounds without permission. Suggest child may have suffered accidental death while trespassing. However, several factors contradict accidental death theory. Child's body was deliberately concealed. Clothing was of good quality, inconsistent with local background children. No missing child reports match description. Estate staff behavior suggests knowledge they are unwilling to share. Detective Sullivan's investigation had been thorough. The file contained interviews with neighbors, local shopkeepers, and even officials from nearby orphanages and children's homes. None had any record of a missing child matching the description of the victim. The most significant document in the file was Detective Sullivan's final report, dated October 15. Despite numerous leads and interviews, no family has come forward to claim the child, and no missing person reports correspond to the victim. The investigation has been hampered by what appears to be deliberate obstruction by parties connected to the Whitmore estate. Staff members have clearly been instructed to limit their cooperation, and Miss Whitmore herself has been evasive in her responses to questioning. Of particular note, investigation revealed that a professional photographer was contracted to work at the Whitmore estate during the time frame when the child would have been alive. Photographer Harrison Pemberton initially denied any knowledge of photographer sessions at the estate, but later admitted to routine estate documentation work. His evasiveness suggests knowledge he is unwilling to share. Physical evidence is limited due to decomposition and environmental factors. Coroner's examination revealed evidence of healed fractures consistent with physical abuse, but cause of death could not be definitively determined. Recommendation case should remain open pending new evidence or witness cooperation. However, given the influence of the Whitmore family and lack of cooperation from key witnesses, successful prosecution appears unlikely. Case status suspended pending new developments. The final document in the file was a handwritten note from Detective Sullivan, apparently added to the file after the official investigation was closed. Personal note: I am convinced that Margaret Whitmore knows far more about this child's death than she has admitted. The evidence suggests she as the child was living at or frequently visiting the estate prior to death. The professional photography session, the staff's evasive behavior, and the deliberate concealment of the body all point to a cover-up. However, the Whitmore family's political connections and social standing have made it impossible to pursue the investigation aggressively. I have been encouraged by my superiors to focus department resources on cases with better prospects for resolution. I fear that this child's death will never be properly investigated, and that justice will be denied due to the influence of wealth and social position. I am placing this note in the file in hopes that future investigators might have better success in uncovering the truth. Sarah sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what she had read. The police investigation had clearly established that the anonymous child in the photograph had been the victim of suspicious circumstances, possibly including abuse and murder. More disturbing was the evidence that the investigation had been deliberately obstructed and ultimately abandoned due to the Whitmore family's influence. Detective Santos, who had been observing Sarah's reaction, spoke quietly. Heavy reading, isn't it? Cases like these are why I became interested in cold case work. Sometimes the passage of time makes it possible to find justice that was denied when the crime was fresh. Detective Santos, Sarah said carefully, what would happen if new evidence emerged in a case like this? Well, there's no statute of limitations on murder, the detective replied. If you found evidence that could identify the victim or provide new information about the circumstances of death, we would certainly be interested in reviewing it. Sarah realized that her research had evolved far beyond academic curiosity. She was now in possession of evidence that could potentially reopen a murder investigation that had been covered up for nearly 90 years. The photograph of the anonymous child was no longer just a historical artifact. It was evidence in an unsolved crime. As she prepared to leave the police station, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of her investigation. She would not only continue trying to identify the anonymous child, but she would also work to ensure that the truth about their death was finally revealed, regardless of the powerful families who had tried to keep it hidden. The stakes of her research had suddenly become much higher, and Sarah realized that she might be putting herself at risk by pursuing a case that had already claimed one victim and had been deliberately buried by people with the power to destroy careers and lives. Sarah returned to her office at the historical archives with a new sense of urgency and purpose. The police records had transformed their research from historical curiosity into a potential criminal investigation, and she knew that she needed to approach the next phase of her work with extreme care. Her first step was to consult with Dr. James Mitchell, a forensic genealogist who had worked with the archives on several previous cases involving identified historical figures. Mitchell specialized in using modern DNA analysis and digital genealogy tools to identify people from historical photographs and documents. This is quite a case you brought me, Dr. Mitchell said after reviewing the photograph and the documentation Sarah had gathered. The good news is that if this child has living descendants, modern genealogy techniques give us a reasonable chance of identifying them. The challenging part will be working with a photograph from 1937 without any DNA evidence from the child themselves. Mitchell explained that their best approach would be to use facial recognition software designed for historical photographs, combined with extensive genealogy database searches. We'll start by analyzing the facial features in the photograph and comparing them to images in genealogy databases. If we can find potential family matches, we can then use DNA analysis to confirm relationships. While Dr. Mitchell began his technical analysis, Sarah decided to pursue a different avenue of investigation. She had noticed that Margaret Whitmore's estate donation included not just photographs, but also personal papers and documents. Perhaps there were additional clues hidden in material she hadn't yet examined thoroughly. Back at the archives, Sarah requested access to the complete Whitmore estate donation. The collection was larger than she had initially realized, filling several archival boxes with documents spanning from the 90s. Sarah began a systematic examination of materials from 1930s. Hidden among routine letters and business documents was a small leather journal that Margaret Whitmore had apparently kept during The entries were brief and often cryptic, but they provided a window into Margaret's thoughts during the period when the anonymous child had been at the estate. The first relevant entry was dated June 10. Father has asked me to take responsibility for a situation that requires absolute discretion. A child has been placed in our care. Absolute discretion. A child has been placed in our care under circumstances that cannot be made public. The child speaks little English and seems terrified of adults. We have arranged for a photograph to be taken. As father insists, we must have some record of the child's time with us. Subsequent entries revealed more details about the child's stay at the estate. June 20. The child is slowly beginning to trust Mrs. O'Brien, our housekeeper. We have learned that the child's name is something like Helena or Alena. The pronunciation is unclear. The child appears to be from Eastern Europe, possibly Poland or Czechoslovakia. Father says the child's parents were killed and that we are providing temporary shelter until permanent arrangements can be made. June 28. However, she still wakes screaming from nightmares and flinches whenever adults approach too quickly. Whatever happened to her family must have been traumatic beyond imagination. July 5. He has been meeting with men I don't recognize, and their conversations stop whenever I enter the room. Elena seems to sense the tension and has become withdrawn again. I fear that the permanent arrangements father mentioned may not be in the child's best interest. The final entry about Elena was dated July 15, Descendants, and it was the most disturbing. Elena is gone. Father says he has been moved to a more rotten situation, but he will not tell me where or with whom. He demanded to know what happened to her, but father became angry and told me that some matters are too important for a young woman to understand. I fear something terrible has happened to that poor child. The photograph I commissioned may be the only proof that Elena was ever here. Sarah felt sick as she read Margaret's final entry about Elena. The journal entries painted a picture of a young woman who had tried to protect a traumatized refugee child, only to have the child disappear under mysterious circumstances, controlled by her father. The entries also provided crucial new information. The child's name was Elena. She was likely from Eastern Europe, and her parents had been killed. This information would be invaluable for Mitchell's genealogy research, as it provided cultural and geographic context that could help narrow the search parameters. Sarah continued reading through the journal, looking for any additional references to Elena or the circumstances of her disappearance. She found one more entry, dated August 10, the same date as Margaret's letter to Harrison Pemberton about the child's death. The police came today asking about an unidentified child found on our property. I knew immediately that it was Elena. Father instructed me to deny any knowledge of the child, and I followed his orders, though it made me sick to lie to the investigators. Father says that revealing Elena's presence here would compromise important work, and that her death was an unfortunate accident that must not be allowed to interfere with larger concerns. I don't believe him. I think Elena was murdered, and I think father knows who did it. This entry confirmed Sarah's worst suspicions about the case. Margaret Whitmore had known that Elena had been murdered, and she had been forced to participate in covering up the crime by her father. The important work that Charles Whitmore had mentioned suggested that Elena's presence at the estate was connected to some kind of larger operation or organization. Sarah's research had revealed that Charles Whitmore had been involved in various business and political activities during. She decided to investigate his activities more thoroughly, particularly focusing on any connections he might have had to European refugees or political organizations. Using the archive's newspaper database, Sarah began searching for references to Charles Whitmore during. What she found was troubling. Several articles mentioned Whitmore's involvement with organizations that had expressed sympathy for European fascist movements. There were also references to business dealings with German companies and attendance at rallies supporting isolationist policies that would have prevented Jewish refugees from entering the United States. The pattern that emerged suggested that Charles Whitmore had been involved with groups that were actively hostile to European refugees, particularly Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. If Elena had been a Jewish refugee child, her presence at the Whitmore estate would have been highly problematic for someone with Charles Whitmore's political associations. Sarah began to piece together a theory about what had happened to Elena. The child had likely been a Jewish refugee whose parents had been killed in Europe. Through some mechanism, possibly involving other family members or charitable organizations, Elena had been brought to the United States and temporarily placed with the Whitmore family. However, Charles Whitmore's political associations would have made Elena's presence extremely dangerous to his reputation and business interests. Rather than allowing the child to be relocated to a safe situation, Whitmore had apparently decided that Elena posed too great a risk to be allowed to live. The theory was horrifying, but consistent with all the evidence Sarah had gathered. Elena had been murdered not by strangers or criminals, but by people who had been entrusted with her care, simply because her existence was inconvenient to their political and social ambitions. As Sarah prepared to share her findings with Dr. Mitchell, she realized that her research had uncovered not just a historical crime, but evidence of what would today be recognized as a hate crime, and possibly even a crime against humanity. Elena had been a victim of the same anti-Semitic hatred that was destroying Jewish communities across Europe, but her murder had taken place in the supposed safety of the United States, carried out by people who should have been her protector. The anonymous child in the 1977 photograph now had a name, Elena, and her story was finally beginning to emerge from nearly 90 years of deliberate concealment. But Sarah knew that identifying Elena was only the first step. If Elena had living relatives, they deserved to know what had happened to their family member, and Elena deserved to have her story told and her murder acknowledged. Mitchell's genealogy research had been progressing in parallel with Sarah's documentary investigation, and when they met to compare their findings, the results were more promising than either had dared to hope. Using the facial recognition software and the information you provided about Elena's Eastern European background, I've been able to identify several potential family connections, Dr. Mitchell explained, spreading a series of printouts across his desk. The software found facial similarities between Elena and several individuals in genealogy databases who have traced their ancestry to Jewish communities in Poland and Czechoslovakia. The most promising lead was a woman named Rebecca Stern, who lived in Chicago and had been researching her family's Holocaust history. Rebecca's great-aunt, Elżbieta Kowalski, had disappeared during the early stages of Nazi persecution in Poland. Family records suggested that Elżbieta had been trying to get her young daughter to safety in the United States when they both vanished in 1938. The facial recognition software shows a strong similarity between Elena and photographs of the Kowalski family, Dr. Mitchell continued. More importantly, Rebecca Stern has DNA results in the genealogy database, and I've been able to identify genetic markers that would be consistent with the family relationship to Elena. Sarah felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. If Rebecca Stern was indeed related to Elena, then Sarah would soon be contacting a living person to inform them that their family member had been murdered in 1937, and that the crime had been covered up for nearly 90 years. Mitchell had already made a preliminary contact with Rebecca Stern, explaining that he was researching historical immigration records and had found information that might be relevant to her family history. Rebecca had agreed to meet with them to discuss their findings. The meeting was arranged for the following week in Chicago. Sarah spent intervening days preparing a comprehensive presentation of her research, including copies of the photograph, the police records, Margaret Whitmore's journal entries, and the genealogy analysis. She also consulted with the trauma counselor about the best way to present disturbing historical information to family members. Rebecca Stern was a retired teacher in her 70s who had spent decades researching her family's history and the fate of relatives who had been lost during the Holocaust. She met Sarah and Mitchell at the Chicago History Museum, where they could examine the documents in a private research room. My great-aunt Elżbieta was my grandmother's younger sister, Rebecca explained as they began their discussion. Family stories say that she was trying to get her daughter to America when they both disappeared. We always assumed they had been killed in Poland, but we never found any records of what happened to them. When Sarah showed Rebecca the 1937 photograph of Elena, the older woman's reaction was immediate and emotional. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "She looks exactly like my grandmother did as a child. The eyes, the shape of the face. This has to be family." Dr. Mitchell explained the DNA analysis that had led them to contact Rebecca. "Based on the genetic markers we've identified, there's a very high probability that Elena was your great-aunt's daughter. That would make us your grandmother's niece and your great-cousin." Rebecca studied the photograph intently, as if trying to memorize every detail. "What happened to her? How did she end up in America? And why don't we have any family records of her survival?" Sarah took a deep breath before beginning to explain what her research had revealed. She started with the discovery of the photograph and worked through the evidence methodically, trying to prepare Rebecca for the disturbing truth about Elena's fate. When Sarah reached the part about Elena's murder and the cover-up, Rebecca's reaction was a mixture of grief and anger. "You're telling me that this child, my family, made it to safety in America, only to be murdered by the people who were supposed to protect her?" "That's what the evidence suggests," Sarah replied gently. "Elena appears to have been a victim, not just of the anti-Semitic persecution that killed her mother, but also of the anti-Semitic attitudes that existed here in the United States." Rebecca was quiet for several minutes, processing the information. Finally, she spoke. "My family has spent 87 years wondering what happened to Elżbieta and her daughter. We lit memorial candles for them every year, assuming they had died in the Holocaust. To learn that the daughter survived, that she made it to America, and then to discover that she was murdered here." She paused, struggling with her emotions. "It's almost worse than not knowing." Mitchell showed Rebecca the genealogy analysis that supported their conclusion about Elena's identity. "We can confirm the family relationship with a DNA test. If you're willing, we have a sample from the photograph that should provide enough genetic material for comparison." Rebecca agreed immediately to the DNA testing. "I need to know for certain. If this child is family, then she deserves to have her story told and her memory honored properly." Over the following weeks, the DNA analysis confirmed what the facial recognition and genealogy research has suggested. Elena was indeed Rebecca's great cousin, the daughter of Elżbieta Kowalski, who had disappeared from Poland. The confirmation of Elena's identity opened new avenues for research. Rebecca provided Sarah with family documents and photographs that helped fill in Elena's background. Elżbieta Kowalski had been a young widow whose husband had been killed in anti-Jewish violence. She had used her life savings to arrange passage to America for herself and her 7-year-old daughter, Elena. Family letters suggested that Elżbieta had connections to a charitable organization that was helping Jewish refugees reach the United States. However, the letter stopped abruptly in early 1937, and the family had never learned what happened to Elżbieta and Elena after they left Poland. Sarah's research into the charitable organizations operating in 1937 revealed that several groups had been working to help Jewish refugees, but their operations were often secretive due to anti-immigration sentiment and anti-Semitic attitudes in the United States. It appeared that Elena had been placed with the Whitmore family through one of these organizations, possibly because Charles Whitmore had presented himself as a supporter of refugee assistance. The tragic irony was that Elena had been placed with the Whitmores precisely because they were thought to be safe, when in reality Charles Whitmore's political associations made him one of the most dangerous people Elena could have encountered. Rebecca was determined that Elena's story should be told publicly. "This child has been forgotten for almost 90 years. Her mother died trying to save her, and she was murdered by people who should have protected her. The least we can do is make sure people know what happened to her." Sarah agreed to help Rebecca prepare Elena's story for public presentation. They decided to approach the Holocaust Memorial Museum and other organizations that documented anti-Semitic persecution as Elena's case represented a little-known aspect of Holocaust history, the murder of Jewish refugees who had reached supposed safety in the United States. The story of Elena Kowalski would finally be told, nearly 90 years after her death. The anonymous child in the 1937 photograph would have her identity restored, her family connection re-established, and her murder acknowledged. While justice in the legal sense was no longer possible, the truth about Elena's life and death would finally be revealed. Rebecca Stern had gained a family member she never knew existed, only to lose her again to the knowledge of Elena's tragic fate. But she had also gained the opportunity to ensure that Elena's memory would be preserved and honored, and that her story would serve as a reminder of the consequences of hatred and the importance of protecting the vulnerable. The photograph, that had started as a mysterious image in a donated collection, had become the key to unlocking a family's history and revealing a crime that had been hidden for nearly a century. Elena Kowalski was no longer anonymous. She was a named victim whose story would finally be told, whose family would finally know her fate, and whose memory would finally be honored as it should have been 87 years ago. As Sarah prepared to publish her research and help Rebecca share Elena's story with the world, she reflected on the power of a single photograph to connect the past with the present, to restore identity to the forgotten, and to ensure that even the most carefully hidden truths eventually come to light. Elena's story was finally complete, and her brief life would no longer be forgot. The story of Elena Kowalski's identification and the revelation of her murder became international news when it was published 6 months later. The case highlighted not only the individual tragedy of a murdered refugee child, but also the broader historical context of anti-Semitic violence in the United States. During the 90 States, Rebecca Stern established a memorial fund in Elena's name to support organizations working with refugee children. The original 1937 photograph was donated to the Holocaust Memorial Museum, where it became part of an exhibit about Jewish refugees who were murdered after reaching supposed safety in Allied countries. The Whitmore family's involvement in Elena's death became a subject of historical investigation, leading to the discovery of other cases where prominent American families had been involved in anti-Semitic activities during the Margaret Whitmore's journal entries were recognized as important historical documents that provided insight into how ordinary people became complicit in hate crimes. Sarah Chen's research methodology became a model for using modern technology to solve historical mysteries and identify victims of historical crimes. Her work demonstrated how photographs, genealogy databases, and DNA analysis could be combined to restore identity to forgotten victims and reveal truths that had been deliberately concealed. Elena Kowalski was finally laid to rest in a Jewish cemetery in Boston, with a proper headstone bearing her name and the dates of her brief life. Rebecca Stern and dozens of other family members attended the funeral, finally able to mourn a child whose fate had been unknown for nearly 90 years. The anonymous child in the 1937 photograph was anonymous no more. Elena Kowalski's story had been told, her identity restored, and her memory honored. The truth had finally emerged from the shadows of history, proving that some secrets are too important to remain hidden forever.